Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Paarlberg. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Wellesley College and an Associate in the Sustainability Science program at Harvard University. His research focuses on the international agricultural and environmental policy, regulation of modern technology, including biotechnology. He is the author of many books, and today we're going to focus on one of his most recent ones, Resetting the Table, straight talk about the food we grow and eat. So, Dr. Paarlberg, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's good to be speaking with you.
Okay, great. So, let me just ask you, is the way we eat, what we basically put on our tables, always a political issue?
Not all the time. For example, if I decide to eat fewer candy bars to protect my health, that's not political.
Okay.
If I tell you you should eat fewer candy bars to protect your health, that's not political either. But if I ask the government to put a tax on candy bars to reduce everyone's consumption, once I engage the authority of the government, then it does become political. Once I either seek or use public authority, government authority, then in my view, you've crossed a line into a political world.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, our consumer behavior also has a political aspect to it, right? I mean, the kinds of foods we consume, etc.
It has a public health aspect. It has a environmental aspect.
Mm-hmm.
It has an economic aspect. It shapes the marketplace. But I like to maintain a distinction between activities that engage the state as opposed to those that do not. In an indirect sense, everything is political. But then you've lost the value of the word. If political means everything, then it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, just to make this clear, the kinds of questions you're focusing on the book, are they all political or not?
They're mostly political, but they're not all political. Some are very personal. The ethic of eating meat from animals. I think that can be a very personal issue. It doesn't have to be political. If I launch a campaign to promote a vegetarian lifestyle, then it does become political.
Mm-hmm. Right, but maybe we will come back to the consumption of animal products later. But if it becomes an ethical issue and then it enters into the political realm, it can become also a political issue, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, would you say that people, particularly in the Western world, consume too much food nowadays?
Well, certainly in the United States, many people consume too much food. In the United States today, 42% of the adult population is clinically obese. That's 3 times the rate of the 1960s. And it's the cause is usually excessive calorie consumption, not genetics. Obesity rates in America have tripled since the 60s, mostly because food calorie consumption has increased dramatically. It's now a public health crisis because obesity is associated with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. The reason for this increase in consumption rests, I think, heavily with the food companies that have designed ultra-processed manufactured products that are high in sugar, salt, and fat. They're designed intentionally to be difficult for consumers to resist. I mean, we have the food companies say, no, it's a matter of personal responsibility what you put in your mouth. But stop to think about it. If obesity has tripled since the 1960s, does that mean we're all 3 times as irresponsible today as we were back then? I don't think so. I think it's It's the foods the companies have put on the market and surrounded us with, and then relentlessly advertised, including to children, that has pushed consumption and obesity rates up. But it depends on what part of the world you're in. In some parts of the world, in many parts of Africa, for example, people still don't get enough to eat, and children are stunted and thin and weak from diseases that are linked to undernutrition, not overnutrition.
Right. But just to try to be a little bit more specific, and since you focused on issues like obesity, when you say that people consume too much food, do you look at it just from a sort of public health perspective? I mean, in terms of the health effects it has on people, or also from other perspectives, like, for example, the fact that maybe if people consume too much food, it might also have a very negative impact on the environment?
Yes, it has that effect as well, particularly if they're consuming things like red meat from ruminant animals that belch out methane when they're digesting their food. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it's 30 times as potent as CO2. And so excessive meat consumption is an environmental concern as well as a personal and a public health concern.
So, I mean, in terms of food production, do we know what would be the best methods of farming that we have at our disposal nowadays? I mean, what are the ones that are best supported by the evidence in terms of both producing the highest quality food for people's consumption and also reducing their environmental impact?
Yeah, it depends on uh, where you are. A lot of these questions about food and farming can only be answered if you identify what part of the globe you're talking about. Optimal farming methods will differ dramatically depending upon the availability of land resources, the climate, the terrain, the rainfall, the labor supply, wage levels, capital resources available to purchase modern farm equipment. In countries that have abundant land and capital resources and high wages, and the United States is an example of that, it makes sense for farming to be large scale and highly automated and mechanized. In countries that are more crowded, with lower wages and less capital, smaller farms that use more human labor make sense, at least in the short run, although I would like to move wages up in those countries and eventually move people out of low-income farming into higher-paid industrial and service sector and post-industrial employment.
So I would imagine then that there wouldn't be any one-size-fits-all solution for farming across the globe. Like, for example, there are people that say that perhaps organic farming would be the best solution across the globe. Other people would point to using genetically modified organisms. Other people would say industrial farming. Other people would say, for example, indoor farming, but perhaps we have to look on a case-by-case basis in each specific place.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. You mentioned organic farming. Uh, Actually, until 100 years ago, when we started using man-made chemicals, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, before that time, all of the food ever produced worldwide was de facto organic. Organic only means no use of man-made chemicals, and before man-made chemicals were available, everything was de facto organic. And that's interesting to me because back then, farmers were poor, and people were not as well fed as they are today. I think I do not favor a return to the organic methods of the past. I don't think they deliver on the promises that the organic sector likes to make.
That's interesting. So, I mean, the kinds of promises that people from organic farming put on the table, that they say that perhaps it would be the best way of having the least environmental impact and perhaps contributing to fight back against climate change and produce enough food for all people. I mean, what would you say are the promises where they fail the most?
Well, if you look at organic production today, where farmers have decided not to use modern fertilizers, where they grow crops in much the same way that farmers did 100 years ago, crop yields are lower, and cost of production is higher. So with lower crop yields, you have to use more land. You have to plow up more land to produce the same amount of food, and that's actually damaging to the environment. It destroys wildlife habitat, and those land use changes release carbon into the atmosphere. Also, those higher production costs mean higher costs for consumers. In the United States, organically grown fruits and vegetables cost 54% more than conventionally grown. The United States does not consume enough fresh fruits and vegetables. If we went to organic, those products would be more expensive, and we would consume even less. And what are we getting for that? In my book, Resetting the Table, I review the scientific evidence concerning the alleged nutrition benefits and food safety benefits from organic products, and I can't find any convincing evidence. Scientists have not found any convincing evidence that organically grown foods are more nutritious than conventionally grown foods. They sometimes claim they are. Organic milk does have 50% more beta carotene than conventional milk from cows that are not fed strictly on organic products. But conventional milk has so little beta carotene that 50% more than almost nothing is still almost nothing. And so nutrition scientists just haven't been able to find any nutrition benefit. And the food safety benefits in advanced industrial countries where foods are monitored, washed, and where the application of farm chemicals is licensed, it's done by trained practitioners. The food safety benefits are also negligible, according to the science. There might be some occupational advantages to the farmers themselves from not using some toxic chemicals, but to consumers in rich countries, those benefits are barely measurable.
And in organic farming, even when it comes to chemicals like pesticides, isn't it the case that they are not completely absent from organic food production? I mean, isn't it the case that sometimes what they use is, instead of synthetic chemicals, they use natural ones, or at least the ones that are labeled as natural?
Yes, that's right. Organic farmers use pesticides. They're, as you say, naturally occurring pesticides, like a naturally occurring soil bacterium, Bt, or they use copper sulfate, or they will protect against weeds by spreading plastic mulch on the field, or they will use gas-powered flamethrowers to burn the weeds instead of herbicides to kill the weeds. The organic rule introduces what I consider to be a lot of needless distortion and increased production cost into farming systems.
Mhm. And what do you think about GMOs, genetically modified organisms? I mean, what does the evidence say about them?
Well, GMO crops are crops that have been developed using modern biotechnology, recombinant DNA technology, um, crops have been developed that are more resistant to insect damage or to chemical damage. Um, in some cases, GMO crops have been made more nutritious. There's a variety of rice known as golden rice that has more beta carotene. So that's a precursor to vitamin A, so it can protect children against vitamin A blindness. What most people don't realize is that these crops in most of the world are not yet legal for farmers to plant. Advocates have worried about new risks from these crops to human health or to the environment, and they've campaigned for very strict regulations, and those strict regulations have prevented farmers in most countries from using these crops. Now, in my book, Resetting the Table, I review what scientists have said about this, and all of the most prestigious science academies in Europe have found no evidence of any new risks to human health or to the environment from any of the GMO crops that have been developed for the market so far. The European Union Commission has said in writing that that the use of modern biotechnology introduces no greater risk than the use of conventional breeding when developing new crops. But governments have listened to advocates and to consumer opinion, and consumer opinion has turned against GMOs in much of the industrial world. And so these crops are seldom grown for direct food consumption purposes. We still grow a lot of GMOs in the Western Hemisphere for industrial purposes, like GMO cotton or GMO yellow maize for ethanol, or GMO soybeans for animal feed, but very little for direct human consumption.
So do you think that GMO crops should be more widely adopted and people should invest more in them? I mean, do you think that the sort of benefits that they bring to the table would warrant that?
Well, it's hard to say because they've been so stigmatized, and the regulations imposed on them have been so strict that new developments and new investments have largely dried up. So we don't know what their potential would have been if they hadn't been so stifled by regulations. What's interesting to me now is that the next generation of modern biotechnology, it's called gene editing.
Right.
CRISPR crops are gene-edited crops. I thought that this new technique was going to escape the stifling regulations imposed on recombinant DNA GMOs because there's no genetic material transferred in from foreign species. It's a process that resembles natural mutation, and yet in 2018, the European Court ruled that gene-edited crops should be regulated under the GMO directive, as though they were GMOs, and so this will. European scientists have complained, but until that GMO directive is rewritten, this will put a stifling blanket of regulation on gene-edited crops in Europe, and we know from past experience that that will be considered the hurdle that other countries should get over as well. And so European-style regulations are likely to spread beyond Europe into Africa and Asia.
Mm-hmm. But particularly CRISPR crops, those are very novel, right? I mean, CRISPR technology is very recent, and so probably, I mean, there are not that many applications of it yet, or are they?
Well, there are applications of it. They've not been commercialized. They're in laboratory experiments. Yeah, they are not. They are, and that's one reason the European Court said that they should be treated with precaution. Of course, the extreme form of the precautionary principle is never do anything for the first time, and And that's a way of maintaining yourself that I don't think is ideal.
Right. So I also mentioned this before, but what about technologies like indoor and vertical farming? What do you think about them? Do you think that they could be good solutions?
There's a lot of innovation going on in this space, so we don't know yet exactly where it's going. Of course, greenhouse production using natural sunlight has been a successful farming method for decades, especially in regions that are vulnerable to temperature extremes from cold weather. But farming inside enclosed buildings using grow lights rather than sunlight is a more recent innovative thrust. And we know that leafy greens can be produced this way, especially for high-end restaurants that like to brag uh, about their food being grown right there in the city. But most food crops don't mature fast enough uh, to make the very high energy costs and the high urban labor costs of these farming techniques affordable. And so a number of vertical farms have they're they're on the drafting board, but they've never been built, or they were built and they've failed. So uh, we don't know. There are forms of urban agriculture that can be quite successful. Community gardens with public support can be a wonderful way to build leadership and help communities remain strong. They don't produce a lot of food, but it's a valuable form of agriculture. I'm not against urban agriculture. I'm a little skeptical though about the commercial promise of vertical farming.
So, apart from these technological varieties and solutions we've been talking about, what do you think about the idea of people consuming local? Do you think that that would be in any way a good solution for the kinds of issues we are trying to deal with here when it comes to food production and consumption?
Well, once again, it may depend upon where you are. If you live in a country where the climate allows the production of fresh fruits and vegetables year round, if you live in a country that has access to fisheries, I guess I'm describing in some ways a country like Portugal. Then, and if you like a traditional diet, you can supply a large portion of your food based on local production. But in a lot of the world, including the United States, that just doesn't work. In the United States, because the winter months are so inhospitable to fresh fruit and vegetable production, because it's such a vast country without nearby fisheries for the interior part of the country. The United States currently imports 50% of its fresh fruit consumption and one-third of its vegetables and 80% of its seafood. If we decided to localize our food system, and if we tried to replace those imported foods, those are all healthy foods, if we tried to replace them with locally grown substitutes, the price would be unaffordable for most consumers, and our diet would be adversely affected. I don't think that I, I'm I don't think countries are going to go in the direction of relocalizing their food supply. Transport costs keep falling, and that gives people more affordable access to foods from a distance, foods that they want to consume, healthy foods, particularly in the off season when they can't get them locally.
Would it even be feasible for a particular country to produce all or try to produce all sorts of food that people consume on their own land? Would that even be possible?
Yeah, you could grow mushrooms in Greenland if you want to. If you're willing to pay to heat the greenhouses. It's no problem. But why would you want to do that? Consumers don't want to pay that much for food that they could get imported from a distance, like China, for example. Ocean freight transport costs, if the foods are shipped in bulk, make the cost of imported foods competitive with those of locally grown foods. And in the off season, you can't grow things locally at an affordable cost. Look at the United States. The United States in 1990 was importing 10% of its food consumption, and now we're importing 19% of our food consumption. Food systems around the world are continuing to globalize rather than localize.
But is that also good for the environment? Because we've been talking mostly about how good it is for consumers, but what about its environmental impact? Is this sort of globalization of food production better for the environment or not?
Yeah, some environmental advocates worry about what they call food miles. Food travels a long distance. Well, maybe we're burning fossil fuels that we don't have to burn in order to make that transportation possible. If we eat locally, food miles will go down and fossil fuel burning will go down. But that's not a reliable assumption because, first of all, most greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector don't come from food transport. They come from food production on the farm. Now, that's the place to look for opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the emissions from transport usually don't depend upon how far the food travels. They depend instead on the mode of transport. Is it land, sea, or air? And on the load size. Is it a bulk load or is it a small, little, tiny load? If you look at the carbon footprint of a tomato that is picked on a local farm and put in a bushel basket and driven in a pickup truck to a farmer's market and then purchased by a consumer driving a private automobile back home, the carbon footprint of each tomato is huge compared to tomatoes that are moved about in bulk by ocean freight over vast distances. It's not the distance traveled, it's the load size and the mode of transport that matters.
So when it comes to politics, I think there's a very interesting question to ask here. So is there any relationship between the kinds of food people consume and their socioeconomic status? I mean, in terms of if they consume food that is higher or lower in calories, high or low quality, if they are able to consume organic, for example.
Well, socioeconomic status matters, of course, within countries as well as between countries. But when you look around the world, a lot depends on culture as well, and on culinary traditions as well. In East Asia, when people get more money, when countries urbanize and industrialize, and become more affluent, the consumption of meat and fish goes up dramatically. These are countries that want to consume more meat and fish, and now that they can afford it, their per capita consumption has increased dramatically. In South Asia, where there are religious stipulations against consuming beef in Hindu India or pork in Muslim Pakistan, when income goes up, meat consumption doesn't increase as much. And in Africa, where especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in the countryside, income has barely increased at all in recent decades. in Africa, people consume very little meat. It would be good for nutrition if they consumed more meat, but there, it's the socioeconomic status. It's their impoverishment that prevents them from doing that. Of course, in the United States, consumers in nearly all socioeconomic categories consume too much meat and too many ultra-processed, unhealthy food commodities and products loaded with extra sugar, salt, and fat. But better educated consumers in the United States, often in the highest socioeconomic categories, tend to become more aware of the health risks of this kind of diet. They become more health conscious, and their consumption of unhealthy foods is much lower than among less well-educated, less affluent populations.
Mhm. So when it comes to the connection between food production and its environmental impact, what are the sorts of industries that contribute most to climate change, for example? Because this is a sort of debate that, particularly when people that promote a vegan diet versus the ones that promote an omnivore diet have a lot of the time when they're trying to understand if it is the meat industry or plant production that has the biggest impact on the environment and how we could overcome that, etc.
Yeah, climate is, of course, a very important dimension of environmental protection, but we also have to worry about very traditional pollution issues, chemical pollution of waterways and soils, deforestation, habitat loss, loss of biodiversity. And it turns out that all agricultural production will have some adverse environmental effects. Both low yield and high yield farming can have adverse environmental effects. For low yield farming, the only way to increase production is to plow up more land, and that destroys more wildlife habitat, and that's bad for biodiversity and the environment. With high yield farming, you can damage the environment with excessive applications of agricultural chemicals, fertilizers and pesticides, or with excessive irrigation, improper irrigation. We've learned, though, that if you use modern GPS positioning and variable rate application equipment and good sensor systems, if you move toward digital agriculture and what's called precision agriculture, you can increase production while reducing the wasteful use of water and chemical and energy inputs. And that's the sweet spot that I'd like to see agriculture move toward. Now, when it comes to climate, yes, agriculture, modern agriculture can damage the climate. Greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizer production, from burning diesel fuel, and also methane from ruminant animals. The animals are a part of this problem. Agriculture around the world is a direct source of roughly 17% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and animals contribute to that, depending on where you are. Meat consumption in rich countries is twice as high per capita as meat consumption is in the developing world. So in rich countries, red meat consumption in particular is something that we should cut back on for the sake of the environment. But in developing countries, animals that are grazed in very dry countries also have methane emissions, and methane emissions from traditionally grazed animals can actually be higher per pound of meat than from animals in modern feedlots, because it takes so much longer for traditionally grazed animals to reach a market weight.
Mm-hmm. So, and what do you think specifically about the solution proposed by vegan advocates? I mean, the idea of completely cutting or reducing to zero the consumption of meat. Do you think that that would be a good solution and that it could be viable?
Well, in much of the world, as I said, per capita meat consumption is still increasing.
Mhm.
In East Asia, for example, it's extremely high today in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, and in Latin America. I guess I would want to know um, how we are going to move a significant part of these meat eaters toward a vegan or even just a vegetarian diet. In the United States, fewer than 5% of consumers are vegetarian, and fewer than 3% are at any one time vegan. I would like to know how will you pull those people away from the diet that they're consuming today. I think it's wonderful if a single individual makes a choice to adopt a vegan lifestyle, including no leather, no fur, not just no animal products in the diet. But I don't know how you can scale that up without an authoritarian government. And I don't want an authoritarian government managing my diet, because they'll then start managing everything else in ways that I might not appreciate.
Right, but just for the sake of the argument, let's assume that we were really able to convince people to stop consuming animal products altogether. Would that be good for the environment?
Well, it it would in most parts of the world, because it's not just the the habitat that's destroyed to create grazing lands for animals. It's the agricultural, the crop production that is devoted to animal feed. Corn production, soybean production in the United States is largely to feed animals. A lot of soybeans are exported from the United States to China to feed pigs in China. If you could somehow get the Chinese to eat less pork rather than continuing to eat more pork, you could reduce pressures on cropland in the United States to produce corn. There's no doubt about it.
Mhm. But for example, sometimes I hear from, let's call them meat eaters, I mean, people who debate vegan advocates, they saying that if we stopped consuming meat, we would need to produce even more plant products, and so we would have to expand the land dedicated to agriculture. Is that right?
Mm. Well, it's such a fanciful vision to stop eating meat. It's pretty hard to say exactly what the scenario would be. It is true that there are some kinds of land, um, dry grasslands, whether that's in the southwestern part of the United States or in the drier countries of sub-Saharan Africa. These lands are, for food production, the only thing you can produce on these lands is meat and milk from ruminant animals, because the grasses aren't digestible inside the human stomach, but they are digestible inside the stomach of cattle and goats. And so, um, yeah, if you told those people they couldn't eat any meat, they would have to leave those lands and go somewhere else. The only way you can sustain a population on those lands is by grazing animals and then eating the meat of the animals. But you can raise, you can take lands that are used today to grow feed for animals, and you could grow something else, a protein crop on those lands, and replace the protein that you won't be getting from meat. But a fully vegan diet is more difficult to maintain, because you have to take care to replace key micronutrients like vitamin B12 that are really only available from animal products or from dietary supplements.
Mhm. So, I mean, going back to the title of your book, Resetting the Table, so in what ways, in what specific ways would you reset our table, particularly in the Western world?
Well, yeah, I think there are things that the United States could learn from Europe, and there are things Europe could learn from the United States. The United States, as I say, has an obesity rate now of 42%. That's roughly twice as high as on the continent of Europe. If you look at European policies, they include, in some cases, taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. I think the United States should move in that direction. European policies often include nutrition guidance on the front of the package of manufactured food products. I think the United States should move in that direction too. Right now, the United States only has a nutrition facts panel on the side of the box, and it's all fine print and small numbers, and it doesn't give consumers an at-a-glance idea of whether they're going to buy something that's nutritious or not. Also, a number of European countries place restrictions on advertising foods to children, especially junk foods to children.
Right.
The United States doesn't have any regulations of that kind. So I think the United States should move in a European direction when it comes to nutrition guidance and discipline on food companies to fight obesity. Also, I think the United States should move in the European direction when it comes to the welfare of farm animals. The European Union, over the last 2 decades, has strengthened considerably its regulations on housing for example, pigs. They now have to have more space, more light, less noise, enrichments, including toys. Pigs in Europe now have to have toys to fight boredom. This has proved to be an affordable reform because the major cost in pig production isn't housing, it's feed costs. And there the United States has an advantage over Europe. I think the United States should impose tighter animal welfare regulations on its livestock industry. As for things Europe can learn from the United States, I guess this goes back to our comment about CRISPR crops. I think the European Union makes a mistake when it places a stifling blanket of regulation on a new food product simply because it's new. And that was the reason given by the European Court for regulating CRISPR crops like GMOs. The European Union doesn't place tight restrictions on breeding practices for crops that rely on mutations. And those are the riskiest kinds of breeding practices. But they've been around for a while, so the European Union doesn't place a restriction on that. It does restrict CRISPR crops because they're new. I think that if you overregulate something simply on the basis of its novelty, you're going to stifle regulation and drive new investments out of Europe into other countries, including in Asia, not just North America.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that some of these issues are political in their origin? I mean, that perhaps they come from political decisions and not really, for example, from scientific research or any of that, and they could be solved on a political level?
Well, it's true. Some of these decisions don't come from science. We talked about GMOs. The science academies say they found no new risks, but that hasn't lifted the regulations. It's fascinating to me that that also in the United States, the progressive groups that say follow the science when it comes to COVID or when it comes to climate change don't necessarily want to follow the science when it comes to innovative food products. But there are cultural differences between the United States and Europe that also play a role here. We know from survey research that the average American values freedom and liberty more than social protections provided by the government. The average European values social protections provided by the government more than freedom and liberty, and that difference is the explanation for a lot of things. It's the explanation for Europe's more precautionary regulation of modern biotechnology. It explains the reluctance of politicians in the United States to impose taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages or to impose regulations on the burning of fossil fuels. These cultural differences are at the foundation of political decision-making on both sides of the Atlantic, and they tend to produce divergent results.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that, and perhaps this will be my last question, do you think that there are decisions that individual people can make in terms of the kinds of food they consume that could have an important impact in terms of all of these different kinds of issues we've been talking about, like, for example, public health, climate change, and so on?
Yes, I think so. For personal health and public health, consumers in the United States, at least, should be eating more like consumers in Portugal. Per capita beef consumption in the United States is down. Per capita beef consumption in the United States peaked in 1976. We've been moving away from red meats, but not fast enough. And we're certainly consuming too much pork and poultry. If consumers in the United States were to eat less meat, especially less processed meat, which is linked to cardiovascular disease in particular, it would be good for personal health, and it would be good for the environment. It would be good for public health. It's something that we're moving toward very slowly. My hope is that in the future, the plant-based imitation meat products that have become recently popular, hamburgers that are made from plant protein, my hope is that they will increasingly substitute for meat from real animals. We've seen this in dairy products. 13% of the fluid milk market in the United States now comes from plants, from rice, from almonds, from coconuts. If we can do this, also look what happened in the fashion industry when animal fur was replaced by synthetic simulated fur. If we can substitute plant-based milk and synthetic fur for real cow's milk and real fur, maybe we can substitute synthetic or plant-based meat-like products for real meat. Right now, those products only take over about 1 or 2% of the meat market, but I'm hoping that in the future that's going to grow.
Yeah, but just one last question. If someone would approach you and say, so I, as a, for example, US citizen, what can I do in my daily life in terms of the kinds of food I eat, perhaps small changes that could have over the long run a significant impact on these kinds of issues?
Well, in the long run, it's probably how parents feed their children and how parents teach their children about nutritious food and healthy eating. That's probably going to make the biggest difference. I hope that parents will emphasize, and that schools will emphasize, the importance of a healthy diet, even if that means spending a little bit more time in food preparation and cleanup, even if that means sacrificing a little bit of convenience. I think that the payoffs from a healthy diet will be good for individuals, good for societies, and good for environmental health as well.
Okay, great. So, guys, the book is again Resetting the Table, straight talk about the food we grow and eat. Dr. Paarlberg, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Well, the book is available to purchase on Amazon. It's available either in a hard copy or in an ebook form. Or in audiobook. If you'd like to listen to a professional actor reading my words, you can get the audiobook if you'd like to listen to English.
Okay, great. So it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this episode until the end. The channel depends on your support to keep running, and so I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview and otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pereira Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Ernst Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colomba, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Kassan, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yasila Des Araújo, Ian Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.